Hello, Aaron. Shalom. Glad you can join me. Shalom, Aaron. Hmm. We will be starting shortly. We'll just have to wait so some of the registered visitors and travelers would join. I hope you're all tuned in as we are about to start a journey into the history of the Via Maris, the road of the sea. Mm. Shalom, Xavier and Almaji. Chavito. We'll be starting in a few shorts. We have some interesting people joining us today. We'll give them a few shorts before we rock on the Via Maris. Shalom, Betty. Shalom, Betty.
Hello there. How are you?
I am great. How are you?
I'm really good. This is so cool.
It is, it is.
It is. Absolutely. Am I alone on this tour?
No, there's some other very cool, interesting people with us. I see Javier here and Alma and David and Aaron. Deb is joining us. And I think it's about time as history awaits no one. And I would like to welcome you all to this virtual journey into the northern coastline of Israel. And it would be also an immersion into the past and into the history of this road called the Via Maris. I would like to present myself to the ones who do not know me here. My name is Gabriel, but everyone call me Gabo, and I will be your guide for the next 45 minutes. So you can call me Gabo the guide. It's as easy as that. And during the tour, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Or if you feel shy, you could also just write your questions or comments in the chat, and I would try to respond. I would also give you some time to put your own input and insight during some of the sites. And I hope this would be as good as the real thing. We are all trying to make the adaptations that the world and the current events are showing us the way to. So without any further ado, I would like to jump right in to one of the best ways to start a tour which is by orientation. Orientation generally is actually a word that was invented in the 19th century by explorers, researchers, and people of the academy when they were fascinated with everything that had to do with the Orient, with the East, as they saw themselves as the center of the world. So everything that was East to them seemed very, very exotic and seemed quite strange to them. So while getting an understanding of how and where they're located, as this, let's face it, is the cradle of civilization, they needed to orient themselves, therefore the word orientation. But today I want to get an orientation about what Israel stands for in this geographical region we call today the Middle East. When we say the Middle East, it means we're standing in the middle of the East. So the East is actually quite far from here. And as you would begin to see, Israel is not just in the middle of the East, if not in the middle of the world. Therefore, we would start our tour with looking at this little beautiful thing called Israel on this little map right here. And if I would zoom out a bit, you can see that Israel is marked right here, and it's part of the world desert, the world strip of deserts that starts in the Sahara and extends to the east. And as some of you may know, Israel's territory, over 60% of it is actually a desert. We call it the Negev. The Negev is actually a word coming from the Bible to describe the south. Going south would be going on Negba, but not just that, if not a whole geographical region, which is this desert you can see here. So we can see Jerusalem and we can see the coastline of Israel. But now I would like to zoom out a bit for you to see the map of the world. Thanks to Google and Google Earth, we could actually get a broader perspective of how our world actually looks like. So before going in, hello to the world from outer space. And now let's dive right back in. You can see there it's a bit cloudy in Europe now. It was pretty sunny today in Israel. But let's look at this strange little bridge that is actually the connecting point between the three big continents we're seeing right here. So we have Africa on this side, and then we have Asia on the right-hand side, and then we have Europe. You might ask a lot of people whether Europe is actually a continent, and they would say that it is not a continent, rather a larger continent called Eurasia. If you would actually look at Asia and Europe, you would discover that they're actually connected to each other. Therefore, separating them would be a shame if you're a cartograph or if you're painting maps. But for our discussion today, we would talk and refer to them as two different continents. And now, going back to our subject of this day, we can see that Israel is not just a small country in the Middle East, but an intercontinental bridge that connects Africa, Asia, and Europe. And if one wants to start and understand the history of Israel, one must first understand what is history, if not his story. And when does his story begins? Once he took the time to write it down. And that actually took place 5,500 years ago in two different locations. The first location is the area we call Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the area we know today as Iraq and a bit of Syria and Turkey. And it is described in the Bible as the region between the two major rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. You could actually see one of them right here. The other one is slowly drying away. And that is actually the first place on the planet where people start writing down their stories, and they're actually writing down the stories of their kingdoms and of the beginning of their small empire into writing. So it was not a pen with an ink over paper at the early days of mankind and civilization, but it was the Sumerians in Mesopotamia that started chiseling little letters and little small images on top of rocks. That type of writing is called the cuneiform writing, and it is the first form of writing in our world, meaning the rise and the dawn of history. More or less at the same time, about 200 years after, I'm talking about 5,300 years ago or 3,300 BCE, before the Common Era. So more or less at the same time, in a little place called Egypt, it was the pharaohs that started describing the dynasties and their achievements as an empire on type of a little scroll they made out of a little plant called papyrus. With their little pictographs, they called what we today know as the famous papyrus. And little by little, these two locations of Egypt and Mesopotamia became the world's first two large empires. And if you would go back to the map and look at right here at Israel, Israel is actually standing in the middle of the world's first two empires. And everything had to go through this land and between the two empires that were trading with one another. They were fighting one another, and they were also trying to absorb influence as well as influence the other. Now, there were two main international roads, probably the first international roads in our world that connected these two empires. One of them was the King's Highway, or the Road of the King, still exists by name in Jordan, and it goes through, this is the Nile, by the way, the Nile River, and although usually we are used to seeing rivers going down south and pour themselves to the sea or to the ocean, the Nile has this funky little characteristic that it actually goes north, and here is its beautiful delta, and this would be Alexandria, or more or less over here, where it pours itself into the Mediterranean Sea. So Egypt was connected to Mesopotamia through two main international roads. One of them was the Road of the King, the King's Highway, as it is called today, which goes through Jordan, and then it reaches Syria and Damascus, and then all the way into Mesopotamia. That road would be the road we would talk about when we would take our virtual tour into Petra, and perhaps even Wadi Rum, also two main highlights of the Middle East, especially Petra, one of the seven wonders of the world which were made by man. But today we're going to grab a little journey into the second international road that connected these two, and I'm of course talking about the Road of the Sea. So the Road of the Sea connected Egypt through the Mediterranean Sea. Let us zoom in, and it went through, and you can see right here, through Port Said, through the area of the Gaza Strip. Gaza, like many of the cities that we will talk about today, is one of the most ancient port cities in the world. We're going to talk about cities with over 4,000 years of history. Now that we know what history means, we know that there was actually a lot of things going down before that current events. And if we talked about Israel as an intercontinental bridge, we might just even go back to the prehistory, where cavemen and Neanderthals and Homo erectus, all types of ancient forms of mankind, of humans, left Africa in their conquest to conquer the world. So the Via Maris, as one of those roads, actually holds many of evidence for those human or ancient forms of human beings that were actually chilling and enjoying life in caves on the little coastline of Israel. So that is a subject for another term, but I just wanted to make you realize how history, as we describe it in its glamorous ways, is actually just a short period of our history, of our story as mankind. So this little road of the sea, or Via Maris, as it is later called in Latin, actually goes from Egypt all across the coastline of Israel through Gaza. Ashkelon would be here. Tel Aviv did not exist in those times, but Jaffa did. If somebody here visited old Jaffa in the past, you would know that Jaffa is also an ancient port city, going all the way up north, more or less all the way up here to Haifa. And then this road of the sea went all the way east to Damascus and then to the vast desert of Mesopotamia. Now, if you would look at this, we'll go zoom back and we can see this world strip of desert, more or less at the longitude line of 30 to 33. And you can see that this chunk of our world actually goes around, and wherever this climate affects it, it would be a desert. And if you'll go just a bit down south, you would arrive to the equator, where everything is tropical, nice, warm, and humid, just as we like it. And now it's time to stop blabbering about maps and about old roads and just dive in to one of the most important sites in the land of Israel. And it's not as old as Jaffa or as Gaza, but it is definitely one of the most important cities in Israel's history. I'm talking, of course, about none other but the old city of Caesarea. So I just wanted to give you a little bird's eye view before we dive into the site, which actually is one of the coolest things that virtual tours allows us. Not just a little narrow perspective, but a wider understanding of a specific site with the context of a much larger region or territory. So this is the old city of Caesarea. Caesarea was built over 2,000 years ago by one of the most famous kings of Israel. And no, it's not King David, but King Herod. King Herod is known as the Builder King, and is probably one of the most controversial kings in the history in the land of Israel. If you would ask me why, I would say there is plenty of reasons why. One of them is because he was not born as a Jew. His father was a former Edomite that was converted to Judaism, but never actually accepted it. And his mother was actually a Nabatean Arabic princess. We talked about Petra, that is the area of the Nabateans. And in that case, he was a breed between all kinds of culture in a period of time that the Jews were not actually responsible for their own lives. Why is that? It's because this is the time of the classic period. I'm talking about the Greco-Roman era, and we are talking about a world of the 4th till the 1st century BCE, and this is the time where the Romans start developing their empire. In the form of culture, we're talking about a little city that little by little expanded and slowly started absorbing what we know today as the Hellenistic culture, meaning the Greek culture. And you would probably be surprised, but till this day, ourselves, me, you, the world, is still heavily influenced by the Greek culture. If I could take just a little small example, I would use the form of governments that we still run in most places of the world. We use to live in democracies, right? So the first democracy was actually originated in the Greek world, talking about the ancient Greek cities, the polis. Polis means a city. Metropolis, or as we call it, metropolitan area today, comes from the ancient Greek cities of the polis. So that is just one form of influence that still affects our lives, but I could basically just lay out everything that we've learned from the Greeks, whether it's philosophy, whether it's science like mathematics, chemistry, astronomy, and the list goes on and on. But I would stop in this moment just to give you a small understanding about this huge culture that expanded in about 30 years all over the world. It was Alexander the Great that left Greece, or at that time it was actually Macedonian, but it was an alliance between many cities that created this first Greek empire. Alexander the Great also passed in our neck of the woods, and he toured this very road right here, the Via Maris, on his road to a much more important region. He was heading to Egypt. After conquering Egypt, he actually continued his journey east all the way to the Hindu Kush Mountains. There, eventually, after conquering every little strip of the road, and that includes Babylon, he actually gets injured by a poison dart. Some conspiracies say that it was actually his generals that poisoned him, but let's not ruin a good story with facts and focus on Alexander the Great dying more or less at the year 323 BCE. And after his death, we see the rise of wars between his generals, that each one wants to grab a portion of this huge cake called the Greek Empire to himself. So the Egyptians were influenced and eventually turned into the hands of Ptolemies. And in Israel, we had many fights between the generals from Egypt, Ptolemies, and the generals from Syria, the house of Seleucus. Some of you may have heard about the story of Hanukkah, where we celebrate the purification of the Jewish temple from the hands of the Greeks. So those Greeks were actually the generals from Syria, the Seleucus dynasty. And one of those bastard generals was Antioch, or Antiochus, as we say in Greek. And he is the one who tried to force the Jews, and here we're talking about the sovereignty, that they lost control of their own land, and he actually placed a little pig statue in the middle of the temple. So what do you think the Jews did? You got it right. They rebelled against the Greek. The Maccabees, as we call them today, went on a journey and was quite the revolt. It lasted for several years, several decades even, but eventually the Jews grabbed autonomy again, and the kingdomship passed between the dynasties of the Maccabees until, like what is happening actually these days, the Jews could not stop fighting each other. And as they were fighting each other, the new kid on the block came in and took responsibility of the matter. And now I'm talking about the Roman Empire. It was Pompeius, one of the leading generals of that time, that came in here to be the judge in this discussion about which one of the brothers of the Maccabees should be in charge. And he told them, after listening to both your stories and even the requests of your people, I decided that I would be responsible over this land from now on. And that is the beginning, the first shot of the Roman autonomy over the land of Israel. We're talking about the 1st century BCE, more or less in the middle of it, and things are getting wilder. So the Maccabees are now trying to slowly rebel against the Romans, but they understand they don't even stand the chance against them. And then it was King Herod that was sent to Rome and asked the Roman emperor of that time. We're talking about the time after Julius Caesar, and we're actually talking about the adopted son of Julius Caesar, Augustus. Soon we would return to this very special, very smart individual, but King Herod eventually was appointed by the Romans the king of the land of Israel. Therefore, I started saying that it was a controversial king. It's because the people did not choose him. He was not one of them, and they did not choose him to be king. But King Herod has his own share of wisdom, and he was the one that is known, or as I describe him, the one who brought the latest startups of his time. And I'm talking about the startups in the architectural world. These are the startups that the Romans invented. And it's mainly focused on two little things, which are an arch and a bow, which allowed the Romans to build roads, aqueducts, and magnificent public structures. So these are the structures that we're about to dive in our journey of Caesarea. And I also prepared a little presentation for all of you so we could actually feel as we're on the ground. And this is where the virtual tour becomes even cooler. So the first public structure that we're going to enter is actually the first theater in the land of Israel. What do you mean theater? Was there actually shows here? Yes, there were actually shows. As you can see this fine gentleman here enjoying the show in the theater of Caesarea. By the way, this theater still exists till this day, and it still hosts shows, live shows. This is the theater of Caesarea. Back in the day, there were about 6,000 people that would gather in this theater right here, and they would all come into what was the greatest shows of that time. I'm talking about the tragedies and the comedies of the classic world. What could be funnier or sadder than coming into one of these seats right here, maybe this seat right here, the number 70, and enjoying a show just like this group right here on the stage with the Mediterranean view. It was this way of controlling people that the Romans developed into perfection, which got the name or nickname of bread and circus. The Romans, as they expanded, they started conquering more and more land, more and more nations, and more people, and they understood that they must maintain peace in order to expand their empire. So they decided to do so with satisfying two of the biggest human needs. First of all, hunger. If you would give your people food, they would stay calm. And the second thing is amusement. If you would keep your people amused, you would keep them calm. Therefore, with the bread and circus of the classic world, the Roman empires created what we know in Latin as the Pax Romana, the Roman period of peace. This period of peace lasted almost 200 years, and there were actually two nations that dared rebel against it. One of them were the Carthagins, and some of you also remember the story of Spartacus and the rebellion of the slaves. And the second nation that rebelled against the Romans, wait for it, the Jews. And we didn't just do it once, we did it twice. The first time was the great Jewish revolt against the Romans that started in the year 66 AD, and it actually started right here in Caesarea. How and what, I'm going to talk about this further down the line. And this was the revolt that got the Jewish temple to be destroyed. And eventually, the year 73, the revolt ends in the story of Masada, which was the last stronghold of the Jewish revolt. The second revolt is the revolt of Bar Kokhba, and it is, let's say, less interesting than the great Jewish revolt. But as we return to the theater of Caesarea, I would say that till this day, Caesarea is considered the peak of entertainment in Israeli culture. And for an Israeli musician, it is considered the peak of his career to fill up the seats you just saw in the theater of Caesarea, as it is considered the greatest success of an Israeli musician. You can ask Shlomo Artzi and Arik Einstein that fill up this theater several times a year. How does it feel to stand on this stage with a guitar in your hand and a microphone in your mouth and just enjoy the best acoustic ever? So you can also ask Buddy Guy, as he was here on a concert about 2 years ago, rocking the blues all the way from the US to Caesarea. So now I'm showing you this very, very cool ancient pool that was actually a part of King Herod's palace. Yes, King Herod really know how to live it largely. Why? He just had about 500 mistresses. He had a wife that was a descendant of the same Maccabees that he took the crown from, and he entered the list of kings that killed their wives and also their sons. So if that's not enough, after killing his wife, he got so sad that he decided to preserve her body with honey. So be careful the next time you call your wife honey, you might get an idea or two. But what I really wanted to show you is this huge palace that today, when visiting Caesarea, we can see the remnants of that palace, and some of these pillars are meant to show us the restoration of what was a beautiful palace with a very beautiful pool with a sea view. Today we call it an infinity pool, but you can see that most of the things we take charge of or we take credit for were actually invented quite some time ago, several millennia ago. So this palace we're standing in right now was actually built by Herod, who was the builder of this entire city. We're talking about the year 20 BCE. King Herod starts a series of construction sites around Israel. He builds Caesarea, he builds the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, and he rebuilds Jerusalem as his capital. And if that's not enough, he builds this little beautiful, huge Jewish temple we know as the Second Jewish Temple that was later on destroyed by the Romans. Now, after King Herod's death, he leaves his crown divided between his 3 sons. Unlike their father, they were all useless. So the Romans take back the autonomy from the sons of Herod, and they start sending governors into the land of Israel to control this very important and crucial land as it is situated in the middle of the world. Now, why did Herod build this city? So it has to do with a lot of things, mainly because he wanted to promote the land of Israel as one of the most important trade stations in the entire region. And he did that with the help of this city as he built the first deep port in the land of Israel. If I would just for a second zoom out to the map, you can see that Caesarea is situated just between Tel Aviv, Jaffa, and Haifa in the middle of the coastline of Israel. It is situated right here, and it is actually the connecting point to what we talked about as the Via Maris, just before it starts heading east into Damascus and into Mesopotamia. So we understood that just like they teach today in business class, the most important thing about your business is location, location, location. So that is what King Herod understood. And after his death, it was the Roman governors that lived in this specific palace. One of the coolest governors that was living in this place, which brings a very, very high importance to Christians all around the world with this historical site, is the Roman governor Pontius Pilatus. He was the Roman governor that eventually crucified Jesus in Jerusalem. and eventually returned to this palace in order to cry about how he hates this land and does not understand why he was stationed here. This is just a short taste about what we can talk about King Herod, but I would move on and we would jump into the next station, which is the Hippodrome. This is where the Romans manifested their control with the bread and circus. This is where the horse racing used to take place. I'm sure some of you back home saw the movie Gladiator. This was actually the places where gladiators used to fight each other, whether it was man versus man, man versus animal, or animal versus animal. Let's face it, in a bloody fight to the death, they were all animals. So this is actually one of my tours. As I was traveling, there was a little group of young girls coming, and they actually started singing as a choir with the view of the Mediterranean. Just one of the little interesting things you can see in the middle of traveling the land of Israel. And what does gold has to do with it? A lot of it. This is actually a treasure that was found several years ago in the waters of Caesarea. There's a couple of divers just went into just a regular dive in the port of Caesarea. They discovered the biggest gold treasure that was ever found in Israel. It was dated around 1,000 years to the Muslim period, and it created a lot of hype through diving in Caesarea. So if you ever come diving in Israel, please remember there are basically two places you got to dive in. One of them is Eilat in the Red Sea, and the second one is Caesarea. You don't know, maybe you'll find your own little treasure, and maybe we would just walk all along this little place that is called the Promenade of Caesarea, which would lead us eventually to the Visitor Center and the Augusteum. This is the area that today is known as the Port of Caesarea. We do not hold trade here, but this today is known as a culinary and cultural center. There are great restaurants around here. One of them is this one right here, Helena. She was the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine, which eventually starts the Byzantine Empire. That is another history lesson. But as you can see, there are many galleries here and some restaurants with gourmet chefs that would prepare you the best fish and maybe even seafood if you can skip the kosher part. But this place right here was the biggest temple of Caesarea, which was dedicated to Augustus, the Roman emperor. Now it's a time to just stop for a minute and discuss the name of Caesarea. Now, most of my tours are held not as a monologue, but as a dialogue. Therefore, for now, I would open your mics and ask you what in your mind, and you can open your own mic if you've placed it on mute, why do you think Caesarea is called Caesarea? What does it mean?
Something to do with Julius Caesar, I imagine.
All right, that's a good answer. We're getting very close to the right answer. That's a good one, Betty. It does have to do with the word Caesar, which eventually would become a description of an emperor. And the idea is that the city of Caesarea was dedicated to the new Caesar, like you said, Betty, but it wasn't Julius Caesar that was stabbed in the middle of the Roman Forum, but it was his adopted son, and it was actually the son of his sister, and that was Augustus. Augustus grabbed hold of the Roman Empire after defeating another runner to the crown, that was Marcus Antonius, and eventually Herod, that was on Marcus Antonius' side, he wants to kiss up a bit to the new emperor. So he said, look, I would build a city just for you, and please take me as one of your allies. And they did so, and some ancient texts actually describe and talk about the fact that Herod and Augustus and Augustus' best friend, Marcus Agrippa, they were like the best buddies. They used to hang out, they used to grab drinks together, party together. And as you know, the Romans really knew how to live at large with things that should not be described when talking live on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. But if you are very, very keen into it, soon on our Puzzle TV platform, you would be able to learn about the Roman Empire and the Roman um, concepts of living. So, living well was one of them. So, now we're about to move on from Caesarea. Just I would like to show you some of the things that were found here, like this lid, this cap of a sarcophagus. Sarcophagus is a stone coffin, which was the way that rich people in the Greek Roman world used to bury themselves. I don't know if some of you recognize this little young lady, but she comes from the Greek mythology and from the Odyssea story, and this is Medusa. And this is not her hair, but snakes that um, are her hair. And if you would look into the eyes of Medusa, you would eventually turn into stone. Now, the second thing we're seeing here was the aqueduct, or is the aqueduct that King Herod built in order to provide Caesarea with fresh water. All right, sorry. I need to share my screen again. All right. Sorry, ladies and gents. So here you can see Medusa. I think you were all shaped into stone as I was speaking to you, but you could not see Medusa. So here she is right here. To your right, you can see her hair shaped as snakes. And it was Odysseus on his journey in the Odyssea, one of the most famous stories in the Greek mythology and in the Greek culture. And he actually stood against her. He did not look into her eyes, and he chopped her head, which eventually helped him to defeat his enemies. And this is the aqueduct of Caesarea, which King Herod built in order to bring fresh water into the city of Caesarea. This is one of the startups. These are the arches that the Romans invented. Believe it or not, 2,000 years ago, people did not know how to build arches. Why? Because it is not as easy as it seems. I would say it shortly here. Usually I do it with some live demonstration, but the way to build this type of arch is actually to start building the stones and piling up from the sides, from one side and the other. And then once you need to start putting out the weight, you need to pile up a pile of dirt. And this pile of dirt would allow you to sustain the weight of the next stone that you would place from both sides until you would place in the keystone. The keystone, once it's placed in with pressure, is the fact that is holding the entire arch in the air. That is what the Romans discovered, which allowed them to build roads, bridges, aqueducts, and conquer the world. This little stone right here is not your typical, sorry, not your typical Baha'i gardens, all right? Sorry. It is not your typical rolling stone, but is actually an ancient stone that depicts, and in the inscription here, it talks about the Roman governor of Pontius Pilate. Just seeing this little stone in the ancient or in the national park of Caesarea makes a lot of Christian groups coming here very, very emotional. And you can actually understand them as Israel is one of the only places in the world where history, faith, and religion can all come into life with just a little story or with a little stone that proves how important this land is. Now, before moving on to our next stop, I would like to ask the crowd, even people that are live with us on YouTube and on Facebook. Is there any questions you would like to ask? If so, you could write in our chat in the comments, or if you want something deeper, you could also email us to tv@puzzletv.com. And now, as we go further and deeper into our journey, are there any questions? Betty, you are my #1 student for this day.
I have to ask you if this is not so much a history question, Gabo, but really in terms of today.
Yes.
Is it mostly tourists who are going to the restaurants and galleries around Caesarea, or have Israelis adopted it as well?
Great question, Betty. Great question. Because the city of Caesarea stood in ruins for about 1,000 years, from more or less the Crusaders period, talking about the 12th and 13th century, all the way to the 19th century. That is one of the greatest Jewish philanthropists, the Baron Rothschild, started helping the Jewish colonies in the region, developing their settlements, their economies. Another thing he did was purchase this land of what we call today Caesarea, and what is known for decades and millennia as Caesarea, and he starts investing in rediscovering the remnants and the archaeological site. Not just that, but little by little, that starts in the 20th century, there was a city built called Caesarea, which today, till this day, it is probably one of the most wealthiest cities in the land of Israel. And maybe you'll be surprised, but even our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, or as I call him, BB King, as he's been singing Israel's blues for the past decade, he has his private residence in the city of Caesarea. So to answer your question, it's actually the Israelis of the region that visit the restaurants more occasionally, as it's considered, like I said, a cultural and culinary center of Israel. And obviously, the people who visit the site can also enjoy the restaurants, but the restaurants survive on the local population. So if you want to grab a little bite of something that is considered more local, you should visit Caesarea. And I see here,
Gabo.
David Atkins, thank you for your comment about being able to come back to Israel. Javier.
Do you know what Herod would say to his wife when he would come back home?
No,
to Mary.
Please share with us.
To Miriam. He would say, "Hey, honey, I'm home." But she could not answer him.
That was the origins of this phrase.
Exactly.
Great. So I started talking about the Jewish revolt, and the reason it started in Caesarea, it's because Caesarea was a mixed city in the time of Herod and in the time of the Great Jewish Revolt. When I say mixed, I do not mean mixed as the 20th century mix, meaning Muslims and Jews and Christians, but I mean Greeks, pagans, and Jews. They were sharing several cities in the land of Israel, but they were not sharing a good way of life. They were actually one against the other. So it was in Caesarea where the pagans actually butchered a large percentage of the Jewish community in Caesarea. And it was the people in the synagogue of Caesarea, which you could actually see as you go into the ruins of Caesarea, that they took the book of the Torah and they were heading off. They wanted to run away as they were forced in doing things that they did not want in their synagogue. The governor of Caesarea called them back and he says, "You cannot go away without my permission, and I would keep you safe, so come back." As they went back, they were actually killed by thousands. And once this rumor started spreading through the land of Israel, the great Jewish revolt against the Romans started. Eventually, it was Vespasian and his son Titus that was sent from Rome in order to suppress this rebellion, which actually got them the best job of the world of that time, being the emperor himself. It was first Vespasian and then Titus, and Titus was the one that eventually destroys the Jewish temple, and he actually takes all the gold, all the wealth that was stored in the temple, because you need to understand that temples in that time was not just a place of worship and faith, it was a place of sacrifice where people used to come and sacrifice something for God, whether it's a pigeon, a goat, or a cow, and it was a bit for God, a bit for the priest, and a lot for the feast. And they would actually eat their own sacrifice. And every Jew that would come to Jerusalem once a year would have to pay a half shekel coin. So imagine hundreds of thousands and millions of Jews coming to Jerusalem every year with half a shekel. That would pile up to a lot of money. And when Titus brings all that gold into Rome, he actually funds the construction of the Colosseum with those funds. Now, a proof of that is the Titus Gate in Rome, where you can see the Jews carrying the menorah, the greatest Jewish symbol and the symbol of the state of Israel till this day, carrying it to Rome. And now, in a short jump, we are about to jump into the beautiful, majestic Baha'i gardens and the city of Haifa. And Haifa is known as probably the most pluralistic city in Israel. It is the third largest city in Israel and one of my favorite places to go and stroll around the city. We're actually looking over the Haifa Bay, and I would like now to use the technology we have and check out this cool image of Haifa. It has about almost 300,000 inhabitants, and it holds more than 4 religions in the city. 4, why? Because we have Jews living side by side with Muslims living with Christians of many denominations and the Baha'i faith, which I would now say a few words about it, because it is probably one of the coolest religions of the world, as it is the newest monotheistic religion. But before that, I would also state that there is even a very special denomination of Muslims in the city of Haifa, known as the Ahmadis. The Ahmadis are a pacifistic denomination of Islam, and they believe that Islam is intended to bring peace into the world, and they would interpret the word jihad not as a holy war, but a holy journey to bring peace. It is a war to bring the peace. So that is a message I can actually adopt. And I think this is one of the messages that were adopted by the Baha'i religion. The Baha'i religion is a religion that started in 19th century Iran, and it started with a man that is known as the Bab. Bab in Arabic means the door. This man believed that he would be the door, he would be the messenger that would prophesize about the arrival of the one and only God, or the manifestation of God on this earth. If this sounds familiar, this is more or less the same story as John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. Same story is told here with the Bab that prophesies about the arrival of the Messiah or God in the form of man to his 19 apostles or disciples. The Iranis of that time, they were not Iranis, they were actually Persians, did not like this man trying to revoke their power over the people and trying to basically go against the Shiite Islam of that time. So they executed him. His disciples gathered his bones and hid them as the storm went by. And it was one of his disciples that would later be known as the Ba'ula. the glamour of God that eventually identifies himself as the man that the Bab was talking about, and he would be the manifestation of God on this earth. Now, the Persians did not like the Ba'ula as well, but as he came from a very wealthy family, they could not have executed him, so they exiled him to a very remote, not important place in a very, very weak Ottoman Empire, to a place called Akko. Akko would be a little short stop we would make before the end, and it's actually situated in front of us. It's a bit hazy here, but Akko is on the other side of the Haifa Bay, and it was the Ba'ula that starts putting down into paper the entire ideology and philosophy of the Baha'i faith. To say a few things about them, the Baha'is believe a message that I think most of us should adopt. They believe all mankind should unite. They believe in all the monotheistic religions, and they believe they are all one. Therefore, we must all unify as humans with one another and with Mother Nature and connect to our roots and to our planet. So the Ba'ula starts writing down and putting all of that into paper, and what would be known as the Kitab el-Aqdas, the holy scripts in Arabic. And he would also start promoting the importation of the bones of the Bab, which is actually buried right here in this beautiful shrine in the middle of the Baha'i Gardens. So the Bab, the messenger, is buried in the Baha'i Gardens in Haifa, and the Ba'ula, the God himself, would be the one that is buried. No problem, Betty. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I didn't get a chance to finish my message. I hit send too soon. You're an amazing guide. Thank you,
Thank you very much.
I will
Cheers,
follow
Betty.
up, okay? It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So it was the Bab that was eventually buried here, and the Bahula, the God himself, was buried in Akko. And Haifa and Akko are the two holiest places in the world for the Baha'i faith. Just to get an understanding, there are about 7 million Baha'is in our world, from the United States through South America, Africa, all the way into India and Australia, where you can find the lotus temples of the Baha'is. And you can see that their faith and their philosophy have broken boundaries and faith and religions. And one of the things they promote are communal projects where they help different societies around the world. One of the things that is holy to the Baha'is is the number 9 and everything that has to do with it, 9, 19, 99. So their calendar is actually made out of 19 days of 19 months. And it has to do with the 19 apostles and disciples the Bab had. And this Baha'i Gardens actually has 19 terraces. And the shrine is located right in the middle. So this is the story of the Baha'i Gardens and of the Baha'i faith. Obviously, it's just a taste out of the city of Haifa, but is one of the most interesting and most beautiful places one can visit. You can see that there are 3 main dominant colors that are controlling the garden. Obviously, green, which symbolizes nature. You can see red, that symbolizes earth and the ground and soil, and that what connects us. And you can see the white, that symbolizes the purification of the unification. There are many symbols in this garden which we could not arrive to them all, so I just wanted to give you a little taste of what Haifa looks like these days. And Haifa is actually another old city, but was developed during the 19th century during the British Mandate, as they built the Haifa port, which was intended to transport their oil coming from Iraq. And the British have all to do with the maps and borders and basically the countries that we know today as Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, as they were the people creating nations in the world of the 19th century. Now, if you guys have any questions, you could also write it to me, whether it's on Facebook, on the chat, or on YouTube. But I would move on to our last site for this day, and it would be the beautiful city of Akko. And Akko, as you can believe, is one of the most ancient port cities in Israel, but it's also a place where the Crusaders had to face the last days of their kingdom. So I'm actually now showing you how the ancient walls of the old city of Akko used to look like. And now as we go into the city of Akko, let's get another taste of the bird's eye view of this majestic old city. You can see that the modern city is rather big and heavily populated. And we're actually going to talk about the area that is surrounded with a wall. And you can see the beautiful Akko beach. Haifa is actually standing just on the other side of the sea. And you can see the Carmel mountain ridge. So Akko, just to give you a little taste of its history, has prehistoric evidence of life, but really started as a small city during the Hellenistic period. We're talking about the first millennia before the Common Era, but moved to where it is today in the 2nd century BCE. Little by little, it was also always considered just a small port city until the Crusaders came here after they lost Jerusalem as their kingdom in the greatest battle of them all, in the battle of the conquest of Jerusalem. So when the Crusaders come here at the end of the 11th century, their goal is to liberate the Holy Lands from the hands of the Muslims, and they do that with the help of the capitals of commerce of Europe. I'm talking about Venice and Florence and Genoa, which were actually controlling and managing the entire commerce that was held in the Mediterranean. Now, these capital cities helped the Crusaders, that were basically Europeans from all over Europe that came here to control and to conquer it from the hands of Muslims. As they did conquer Jerusalem, they also conquered the city of Akko. And it was about 100 years, even less, that has passed until the Crusaders lost in the Battle of Horns of Chitin, Karnei Chitin, to the great Muslim leader of Saladin. And then the Crusaders sent reinforcement, and then it allowed them to reconquer small parts of the coastline of Israel, just this land we toured today, and which allowed them eventually to make Akko the new capital of their city, as they could not reconquer Jerusalem. So Jerusalem stays in the hands of the Muslims in the beginning of the 13th century, and Akko becomes the main center for the Crusaders. One of the interesting things is that the city was divided into quarters, where the capital, the commerce capital of Europe, Venice, Genoa, and Florence, each received its own quarter. And not just the capitals received those quarters, but also the orders of the Templars and the Hospitallers. These were orders of monk that were warriors as well. This was the startup of that time, that a monk could also be a warrior. And these were the people that eventually were the ones securing the roads. These were the Templars, that their name originates in the Temple Mount, as that was their headquarters, the Templum Salomonis. Therefore, they were called the Templars. The Hospitallers were in charge over the health of the people of the pilgrimage that were held during the time that the Crusaders controlled the Holy Land. Remember, there were Christians, and the Holy Land, where Jesus lived, prophesied, and ascended to heaven, was the holiest place on earth for them. Eventually, they lost in battles to a new rising Muslim empire. These are the Mamelukes, and the Mamelukes were warrior slaves that were kidnapped when they were kids from their homes, trained as warriors till the age of 18, only to be converted to Islam, which would make them faithful to the Muslim leader. Eventually, they were the first nation to defeat the Mongols as they were rushing through their journey into Europe. They defeated them in a battle here in Israel, but the Mongols eventually returned to Asia and stayed mainly in China and Mongolia till the fall of their dynasty. So I want to give you just a little short tour right here in the old city of Akko. This is parts of the old city. You can see this great mosque right here. This mosque has to do with one of the most famous governors of Akko. His name was Ahmad el-Jazar. El-Jazar in Arabic means the butcher. They call him that because he used to chop down all the small parts of faces of his entourage. One of those purple was actually his Jewish counselor, which name was Chaim Ferchi. And this guy lost his nose, ears, and even eye because he made several mistakes. So we can see this beautiful minaret that was built by El Jazar. And as one goes into Akko, one must visit the Knights Hall, one of the famous places in Akko, which also granted the UNESCO World Heritage Site title due to the interesting encounter between Crusader remnants and Ottoman remnants, one on top of the other. The Mamelukes destroyed everything that was actually in Akko. So when the Ottomans came, they just rebuilt everything on top of it. So you're seeing here a citadel that was eventually turned into a prison cell where the Ba'ula, the Baha'i God in earth, was actually prisoned in here. And this is a great example how Israel is actually a chocolate layer cake of history and civilization. So whenever you come here to Akko, you must pay a visit to this beautiful, beautiful site. Just looking inside, one can see how the Crusaders used to live. And now I'm actually standing in the most important room in the entire citadel, the dining room. And as Napoleon says, the army marches over his stomach. And that was true. Just like the Romans understood with their bread and circus method of controlling nations, the same thing has to do with the Crusaders. And they provided food for pilgrims and for the orders of monks. And I mentioned Napoleon, not because he is a very, very known wise gentleman, but also because this is the room that I just showed you during the night. It is lit very nicely because Napoleon also tried to conquer Akko from the hands of Ahmad el-Jazar. When he started his journey here to the land of Israel, he wanted to interrupt with the British Empire's expansion, and he arrived here to the land of Israel, and he ascended through the Via Maris, the road of the sea, and eventually he lost his siege that lasted over 3 months, and after he lost many, many men, he decided to flee back to France, and that is when he would become the Emperor of France and the conqueror of Europe. And after he conquered Spain and Portugal, that actually lit the match that started the fire of the independence of the South American countries. That and more I can tell you in another video that would talk about South America and everything that has to do with the liberation and independence of those nations. But our tour, although was probably long for some of you, is about to be finished. So I would like to thank all of you for joining me here today and for just having fun, taking travel into the next step. And as we are defeating this virus that shakes and changes our reality, we must remember that as mankind, we survived greater things and worse things. And together we shall prevail. So I'd like to thank all of you. Gabo the Guide here with Puzzle TV. And I would like to invite you, all of you, to follow us on social media and join our newsletter as we publish our online schedule. On Sunday, we have a very, very interesting lecture about the what is known as the deal of the century, Trump's plan of peace and prosperity. Hopefully, it would bring all of that into our world. But till then, stay safe, keep your smile up, and come to Israel whenever you can. As we say here, yalla bye. Thank you.